Welcome back to another episode of Roundtable, our podcast here at Mid-America Reformed Seminary. My name is Andrew Compton. I'm Associate Professor of Old Testament Studies, and looking forward to resuming our conversation about chaplaincy ministries. You'll remember last episode, Dr. Alan Strange and I introduced the topic. Alan gave something of a background to how some of our churches have originally gotten into chaplaincy ministries, and we discussed broadly about the many opportunities there are for ministering the gospel of Christ outside of what you might call a traditional solo pastor role. And we started to get a sense of the numerous opportunities for ministry that we find in the chaplaincy. Well, over the next few episodes, we're hoping to welcome some guests who serve in different forms of chaplaincy or have served in different forms, just to get a sense, again, of ways in which ministry is happening in a number of settings outside the ordinary weekly rhythms of a local church. So this morning, I'm really thrilled to have two of my colleagues here, Brian Blummer, our Director of Enrollment Management, and Reverend Paul Ipema, our recently hired Assistant Professor of Ministerial Studies, so a new face here around the seminary, although not a new face to ministry in general. Joining us also is Jared Luchabor, our Director of Marketing. It's really good to have you with us, gentlemen, and we're looking forward to hearing your reflections on your time ministering to prisoners.
I'm Jared Luchabor, jumping in here. Thank you, Brian and Reverend Ipema, for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Could each of you at least introduce us in the beginning here? Which prisons were you both involved in your ministry?
Yeah, with mine, I was strictly a chaplain at Westville Correctional Facility, which is Indiana's largest state prison. And I was there for about 4 or 5 years.
How many inmates? How many inmates were there? How many inmates were in that prison?
Yeah, there were 3,000 inmates on the camp there with 4 chaplains on the staff.
Oh, wow.
So we were pretty spread out with our specific areas, and we covered all the security levels there. So we had ones who were minimum security. They'd go out on work details. You'd see them at the dunes or something like that, cleaning up trash. And then we had all the way to Supermax, where they weren't seeing other human contact at all.
Wow.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
What about you, Reverend Ipema? Where were you stationed?
I served several different prisons, both in Illinois and Indiana. I served at the Danville Correctional Center, which is about an hour and a half south of where we're at here at the seminary. It's a medium security level facility. Most of the men in that prison had served time at a maximum security prison and have been leveled down, as they say, to medium security because of the time that they spent, also because of good behavior. I also had opportunity to teach at the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, Indiana, which is a maximum security prison. And then also the Westville Prison, where Brian was at as well. I taught at all 3 facilities. I also had opportunity to conduct chapel at the Stateville Prison in Joliet, Illinois, which is also a maximum security prison.
What inspired both of you to become involved in prison ministry or chaplaincy? Brian, let's start with you.
Well, I had this option right after seminary that was called Clinical Pastoral Education, CPE. It was purely an option that I did for myself, and I'm so glad that I did. That kind of cemented the idea for me because I had this inclination through seminary that I wanted to do it. Part of it was just having nerves for public speaking, so I knew I didn't want to do a traditional pulpit ministry at that point anyways. But I also had, beyond that, a grandpa who was a care pastor growing up, seeing him do that work, and then he also went into hospice chaplaincy. I just really was inspired by that. I enjoyed talking with him about his work and hearing the interactions that he was having, caring for people that way. And that was such a treat. Finally, prison chaplaincy came, though, through being able to volunteer with different organizations that were around here, a Cook County Prison Initiative, Chicagoland Prison Outreach, but also Divine Hope eventually coming around with Paul. And that was really fun then when we would cross paths at Westville.
Sure, yeah.
Being through security and then walking in together, Paul and I here. So,
Okay.
yeah, that was there was the cementing of the idea, but then growing it.
And for me, it was very providential how the Lord led me into prison ministry. I never thought that would be something I would ever do. Not because there was no interest, I just didn't think that it would ever happen. But back in 2010, I had begun a series of courses with the Christian Counseling and Education Foundation in suburban Philadelphia. I wanted to enhance my ability to serve as a counselor in the local church, as a pastor. And as I was drawing near to the end of those studies, which took me 5 years, so in 2015, I really felt called by the Lord to expand upon that work in terms of trying to focus on pastoral ministry or some other venue that I could do that while still doing the work of ministry. And in God's providence, I was contacted by Reverend Ken Onema of Divine Hope Reformed Bible Seminary, who had asked me to teach a class on anger at the Danville Correctional Center, and I did, and I loved it. That really got me interested in it, and he informed me that the seminary was looking at expanding their faculty and adding another member who would be focusing on ministerial studies. And so, as it turned out, later that year, in the middle of the year 2015, I applied for a position at Divine Hope and was called to do that work, and loved it very much. It was a remarkable, wonderful time in my life in terms of the ministry experience in prison.
So elaborate on that ministry experience. What was the ministerial approach that you each took in building relationship with inmates, sharing the gospel with? I'm curious now. What did that ministerial experience look like with your relationship with the inmates?
Well, for me, I was in an academic format, classroom format. So my interaction with the students was primarily as an instructor, but the kind of instruction I gave was designed to be a very practical, discipleship-oriented sort of instruction. Even though it was called Divine Hope Reformed Bible Seminary, we weren't really a seminary. It was a name that we chose because of reasons that were beyond us. It was a name really that was given because of legal issues, that we couldn't call ourselves a college or anything like that, or a Bible school, so we called ourselves a seminary. But when people asked me what we did in prison, I told them it was intensive discipleship. So it was education, but education that was geared towards teaching the men how to be Christian men, how to be Christian husbands, fathers, members of society, how to function as a Christian in prison and also outside of prison. But there were plenty of opportunities also to cultivate relationships, to do counseling. There were a number of opportunities where students would come to me and talk to me about problems they were having, whether it was in prison, but more frequently issues with their family, particularly with a spouse or a former spouse, or with their children. That's a very common problem that men in prison have. So we were able to provide counseling and advice, and then also conducting chapel services. You have many opportunities to speak with individuals who are not even part of the Divine Hope program. They simply attended chapel and they had questions. They wanted us to pray with them, which we were happy to do. So there were all sorts of opportunities to cultivate relationships. And I would say in particular, the one that stands out for me was I taught a group of men, varied in size from about 6 to 10 men, who would lead the chapel services. And so we did that for several hours once a week. And I became very close with those men, and am very happy to say, very grateful to the Lord that many of those men continue to lead chapel services at the Danville Correctional Center.
Yeah, and I always thought it was fun, Paul, because the volunteers and the chaplains were the same, but we're also different. You know, I don't know if you ever noticed that too from
Yes.
our work. But it was just, there were similar qualities to our work, but also different. in that we had to be more guarded as chaplains. We had to be more careful because the administrative side of chaplaincy could consume us, where you guys were 100% out with the inmates, the offenders, working with them, discipling. And we're back doing paperwork, we're screening volunteers, things like that. So that became an interesting balance to have to walk through as a state employee now. There was very much the care side. So our volunteers led our services. They taught a lot of our classes. What I made sure that I did was, in an 8-hour workday, be out in the camp 6 hours a day. And most of that was just going barrack to barrack, bedside to bedside. There was a hospital unit in the prison. We had a hospice unit at Westville, which was really interesting.
Yeah.
When you think about that, prison, and you have people who are on their deathbeds,
Wow.
sometimes a year at a time. But going out, doing counseling, doing visitation of the flock that way.
Yeah.
And we also had a balance that we had to walk, because if we were perceived as getting too close to inmates, fellow staff would start looking sideways at us, like, is this a fraternizing? They're not used to this sort of pastoral component. They're used to the security side.
Sure.
And inmates would look at us differently too, because volunteers are there out of the kindness of their heart. And they look at us, we're not corrections officers, we're not in that blue uniform that they're used to seeing, but we're still there for a paycheck. And that can sort of make them look at us sideways too, like, what's our motive for being here? And you had to be out and about to build that rapport, to kind of get over both of those sides. Let the staff see you're not there for inappropriate reasons, and let the inmates, the offenders, see that you are there for appropriate reasons. Yeah.
How'd you guys balance not only the spiritual dynamics of your work and your conversations with the men in prison, but even just the practical needs of the inmates in your ministry?
Well, for me, with working with Divine Hope, we were fairly limited in our ability to address practical needs. I'll give you an example. At the Indiana State Prison, we made a practice for some time of giving to our students free of charge basic toiletry supplies, because most people don't realize this, but in prison, the inmates have to pay for things like toothpaste and toothbrushes and other things that are basic to personal grooming, even in prison. And unless they have outside support, it's very difficult to find enough money, even from their jobs, which pay very little, to meet those needs. And so we would donate supplies like that, deodorant, body wash, that sort of thing, shampoo. And eventually that came to an end for reasons I'm not entirely sure of, but we were told, no, we can't do that. The warden had said to us that has to stop. And that was a very hard thing to do, because we had several students that dropped out of our program because they had to find a better paying job on campus there at prison so they could afford basic necessities. So for us, we were fairly limited in what we could do. And I would just say, and Brian can speak to this perhaps more fully, but you're warned by the administration at the prison that those sort of personal, practical needs, you are to be very careful even talking about them, because there's concern about volunteers like myself trafficking supplies. It's something that's monitored very carefully. You jeopardize your ability to go to prison if you are doing things inappropriately. In fact, every year we get tested as volunteers over the policies of the state regarding what we can and cannot do with those who are incarcerated. It's very clearly stated that pretty much everything that we want to do beyond our instruction has to be pre-approved by the administration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting you say jeopardize your ability to go to prison. Some of these guys are fighting for their lives to stay out, but that's just where we are. But you are absolutely right. The the suspicions that can arise, the challenges, the issues. You're always on this tightrope, between the practical and, the inappropriate and things like that. It's really this strange, bizarre world that's in there. People always ask me, though, like, how free were you? Was it, you talk about different things that are going on in the world now, like, do they tighten you from doing your work and things like that? And I said, I was never freer, I think, to do the gospel work than I had ever felt anywhere else. The guys know who I am. I was an all-male facility. There's female facilities. I'm sure it's the same there. They knew who I was. I walk on the deck, hey, chap, and they knew that I was a Christian, that I was a Christian chaplain. And so they would ask questions, and that prevented the certain policies that were out there of evangelizing. I forget what the technical term was, proselytizing. Mm-hmm. There were those barrings and policies and so forth really never came into play because they were initiating the conversation anyways, and they knew who I was. So it was very freeing. And at the same time, we would have our clerks come to the office and they'd bring their sack lunch with them, and you'd look at this bologna that they would have with them, and it's not even bologna. It's a total mystery meat, and it's like, these guys, they're doing such good work for me. I'd love to bring them a good meal, and things like that are they're totally out of line. They're totally against policy, and it's just like it pulls at my heart, to see that. And meanwhile, I'm bringing leftover meatloaf from home that's just worlds better than what they have. It's so hard.
Yeah. Did you guys ever experience having to navigate some potential conflicts between your faith and the policies and regulations of the prison system?
I don't know that I experienced that in a profound way. I think there were some minor issues that came about. You had to be very guarded in terms of addressing issues of a political nature. In fact, it's best to navigate away from that. I remember I had made a comment in class one time regarding somebody from American history that I described as a devout Christian man, and a student took exception to that because this man had been a slave owner. And I actually ended up having to report the incident to the chaplain. That's policy again. If somebody wanted to, an inmate wanted to make a grievance against me, I had to guard myself against being dismissed by explaining the situation. But in terms of policy, we had to be careful also not to speak negatively about other faiths or other denominations even. Say, for example, in a chapel service, especially, I think, where you have a wide variety of men, not just men from our program at Divine Hope. So we tried to be positive about what it was that we were presenting and not really interacting with other religions or other parts of the Christian faith. So I would say that was really what we had to navigate more than anything else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, it was a different situation for the chaplain. So, for example, during business hours, Islamic prayer comes about. And so we have to open the chapel to Islamic prayer. And because it was business hours, they didn't want to give up custody staff, correctional officers, to go and supervise and do the paperwork of the service and all that. So they would have me in the Islamic prayer service, again, not participating, but greeting the guys, welcoming them. We had to make sure that there was equal and ample time for every organization. And there are more religions in prison than they ever teach here in missions and evangelism or anything like that. Wow. Beyond, what's in our textbooks and all. So it was an eye-opening experience. Yeah. And again, there was nothing uncomfortable about it because I'm welcoming the guys, I'm greeting them. These are the same guys I'd see on the walks, and they would come and, okay, I'm not in your service, I'm not in your faith, so I'm going to stand in back and there was that component.
Sure. Well, I would add to that as well, Brian, that at Divine Hope, we did not limit our student body to those who profess the Christian faith. We had Seventh-day Adventists who were part of our group, people who were atheists and told us so. I even had a student who claimed to be a Satanist in class, which of course was an interesting experience.
Sure.
But looking at it from an evangelistic ministry point of view, why wouldn't we invite them? We're here to teach them the gospel. I want a Satanist to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. I want others of different faiths to hear that. And again, we want to be positive in terms of expressing what it is that we believe the Bible teaches. But certainly there are a wide variety of men in chapel services as well. You get all sorts of people that will show up, some of whom are there because they want to hear the gospel and because they want to worship. There are others, as Brian well knows, who are there for other reasons, which I don't know that I'll get into, but let's just say they're less than honorable purposes. In fact, other chaplains have told me, for example, at the Indiana State Prison, there was all sorts of inappropriate behavior going on during the chapel service, including gang activity, gang business, drug transactions going on. So again, we want to allow as many as want to be there and can be there, but we also want to make sure that what is the focus is the gospel.
You guys willing to share any examples of or stories of inmates who have experienced transformation or positive changes as a result of your ministry or chaplaincy?
Well, I can speak of several, but I think about the men that I mentioned earlier who are involved in our chapel ministry. I've seen them mature. Now, many of those men are committed Christians when they start with our program. So in that sense, we have an advantage of working with men who already know the gospel, know the Bible fairly well. And in fact, a number of the African-American inmates who are in that program, formerly outside of prison, were involved in assisting their pastors in leading worship services and even preaching. They don't have the kind of strict rules that we see, for example, in Reformed churches about who may and who may not preach or exhort. So just to see the maturity, to see a man deliver the word in a chapel service, or just to conduct a worship service, understanding and explaining to the men in the room what it is that we're doing in worship, is such a wonderfully gratifying experience. But yes, we've also seen, and I'm sure Brian has as well, men who knew little or nothing about the gospel, and through the work of the ministry of Divine Hope or through the chaplaincy ministry, they come to faith in Jesus Christ. And it is a wonderful experience to see men really being delivered from the pit. That's how I would describe prison life. And for many of these men, of course, being in prison is the lowest point of their life. I always assume that when I lead a chapel service, is that many of these men are wrestling with, how am I going to deal with my life now that I'm at this point? This is as bad as things have become for me. And I often will say that you may discover, looking back years from now, that the greatest blessing is that the Lord brought you to this place and turned your life around. And there have been a number of men that I saw in nearly 8 years of ministry in prison, men who came to faith in Jesus Christ. And it's just a remarkable, wonderful thing to see God's grace at work in their lives.
From our standpoint, we kind of had to take the little successes that came along the way. The guys that are lining up for their Divine Hope class, and they're all excited to go there. Like, that was a little boost to the energy to keep going in the job, to see that, or to go to the graduations too. And I was just so thankful that Divine Hope would include us as chaplain staff in those ceremonies. So just those little things along the way, because if you take the sort of macro, like what do people think is a success, not going back to prison, you come to realize the system can be just so weighted against that goal. If you have a job and you lose the job, you go back to prison. Or if you have a job, you can't get released to go to a parole appointment, you could go back to prison. And so you just need those little boosts for when John has left, but he's come back. Well, okay, maybe there's a circumstance I don't know about, but let's help him keep going, and use that. I just think too, like I saw my first adult baptisms in prison. How incredible, and I started this job after seminary. I'd been in Reformed churches all my life, so this would have been, I was 34 years old when I started this job, and I'm seeing my first adults converted, brought into faith. How cool that was to be able to participate, to enjoy that, to witness that. Just really good.
So we probably have some, perhaps, listening right now who have the desire to enter into the prison ministry or chaplaincy. What advice would you give to someone considering that career?
I would say if they want to get involved in prison ministry, I certainly would encourage that. And I think Brian would agree, there's an urgent need for volunteers and for ministry in prison. It is such a dark and in many ways a hopeless place, and the light of the gospel is so urgently needed in that sense. I would say even if someone doesn't want to make that a vocational transition, if perhaps, say, you want to be involved on a volunteer basis in your spare time to do that, contact a local prison. See if there is some way that you could lead a Bible study or participate in some way. People who are in the chaplaincy there are always looking for volunteers. Brian hasn't said it because he's modest, but my impression of
where's this going?
My impression of most chaplains, I would say all the chaplains I've worked with, they are overwhelmed by a mountain of administrative duties. And quite frankly, they have precious little time to do pastoral work. And many of them have testified to that to me, that they're so grateful for people like us who come in there and do that work as volunteers to help them, because they simply don't have time or opportunity to do that. So I think there are a couple of ways that people can get involved. Perhaps our churches can begin to organize ministries, and maybe someone may look at full-time vocational ministry in prison. Like I said, there's certainly a need for that, but I think on a broader level, many people can get involved. And I have told people, and I'm sure Brian would agree with me, my experience has been when I have brought people from various churches to attend a chapel service, I have never had one who was sorry that they went to the chapel service. Every person that I have brought to prison, either in a chapel service or in a classroom setting or at a graduation ceremony, many of the board members from Divine Hope would come to the graduation services, are always impressed with what they see and are very touched by how grateful these men are. These men are overwhelmingly grateful that someone cares enough to come and visit them and bring the gospel to them and minister to them, to pray with them and to talk to them about their faith and about all the ways in which their faith has affected different aspects of their lives, personally, family, and basically how they cope with prison life in light of the fact that they've come to faith in Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I would say, remember, it's a beautiful world coming into the prison. Seeing things like that, it's also very bizarre. You interact with things that our bubbles and circles don't typically interact with, and that's okay. You can get through it. And sometimes, the right person comes and thrives. For us, ministry on the inside, we had a wealth of volunteers who were willing to do that. We were very thankful for that. I would say, there's ministry that happens on the inside, but think outside the box too, and remember that incarceration is as much on the outside as well, because we have probation and parole,
Absolutely.
and reentry centers and all these things. So there are opportunities outside the wire, outside the fence, that you can interact with as well. So looking at those, bringing them toilet supplies as well, or clothing, thinking even of like khakis and shirts, because when they leave the reentry center, they need a job interview, and so remembering those things as well. There's correspondence ministries too that you can do as a Christian. So like a Crossroads prison ministry, you don't even need to go into the fence. If you're a long drive from a facility, well, now you can minister to someone by being sort of a pen pal, grading their Bible studies that they send you, but also sending them letters and notes. Those are ways you can interact as well. So I would say for someone who's considering it vocationally, it's not for someone who's just a dropout of the ministry. There are actual needs that are there. There are gifts that suit. It's not because you failed over here, come over here.
Right.
If you have a real gifting, a real heart, a real calling, that's legitimate. And I was glad in the intro conversation that Alan Strange pointed out there is room in church orders, even in Presbyterian circles, for this kind of a ministry. But I would say be guarded, be pointed when you go into your interview. Ask administration and ask fellow chaplains. Lord willing, there's fellow chaplains who are there. What are the goals for my ministry? If it's all paperwork, then they need to tell you that. I was very thankful when I went into my interview. I asked that question, and they said, we want someone who's going to be out and about. And thankfully, we had 3 other chaplains to spread the wealth of paperwork. Eventually, it can grow, and you need to fence out your space, But be very pointed in that interview. What am I supposed to do? And weigh that against your gifting, against your calling. And Lord willing, I pray that it would bring a very faithful ministry ahead of you.
I would add to that as well that if this is something that interests you in terms of actually going to prison and ministering among the incarcerated, you must be flexible in terms of understanding that you're entering into a situation, a field where, as Brian has mentioned now several times, you have all sorts of strange and often conflicting ideas about religion. Also understand that many of these men have little or no knowledge of Scripture or of the gospel story, anything like that. So you must be flexible and not so firm and so inflexible about people. Your expectations need to be, I would say, reasonable. And in that sense, too, you need to be patient, because change in that environment is often slow and it's incremental. If you think that after one chapel you're suddenly going to find a group of men who are fully converted to the Reformed faith, guess again. There are all sorts of things that have to be sorted out. Ministry is messy, whether you're in prison or outside of prison. And if you can, and I say this to seminarians as well, if you can't deal with the messiness of ministry, you ought not to pursue ministry. At least you ought to think twice about pursuing ministry. Ministry is messy, and even more so within the context of prison. And just the environment in which they live, the pressures against which they face are sometimes overwhelming, especially, for example, and Brian can speak to this as well, that when there's a lockdown, say there's been some kind of an assault either upon another inmate or upon a staff member, and they go on lockdown for sometimes weeks at a time, maybe even months at a time. The effect of that upon the psyche and the spiritual well-being of the inmates is palpable. I mean, it's quite remarkable. And again, you have to be able to deal with those things and deal with disappointments also of being told, for example, you can't come because of a lockdown. You can't do this or you can't do that. And you have to be flexible enough to say, I'll work with the system, I'll work within the system, and the Lord will use me in the way he sees fit.
Mm-hmm. I would just add to that, if I can. Take care of the chaplains who are in your life and take care of their families. Mm-hmm. It's a lockdown. You feel the sort of powder keg that a prison can become. Tensions rise, stress goes up. But in general, too, the question is always, who chaplains? The chaplains, you know. And so take care of them, champion them, chaplain them, and champion them, champion their families as well. Because I know for a fact the last day I walked out of the facility, on my last day of the job, my wife breathed a sigh of relief, you know. And so be good to them, care for them. They need it. They need it too.
Well, thank you, Brian and Reverend Ipema, for taking the time to join me. And this is really enlightening to hear about prison ministry, so thank you.
Thank you.
Next time, alumnus of Mid-America, Reverend Phil Chilker joins Dr. Andrew Compton for a discussion on hospital chaplaincy. Stay tuned for that. For more podcast episodes, you can find us on our website at midamerica.edu/podcasts and wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Be sure to search for and subscribe to Mid-America Reformed Seminaries Roundtable. I'm Jared Luchabor. Till next time.